I knew something irreversible had begun the moment I caught my own reflection flinching before I did. That sentence still feels strange to write, because at the time I didn't yet have language for what was happening, only a low, steady awareness that something I had carefully ignored for years was no longer willing to stay quiet. I wasn't unhappy in any obvious way. My life looked fine from the outside, work that paid the bills, friends who knew my jokes, family who trusted my stability. But beneath that surface was a persistent sense of impersonation, as if I were performing a role that had once fit well enough and now chafed everywhere. The night everything started wasn't dramatic. No breakdown, no revelation. Just exhaustion. The kind that comes not from effort, but from restraint. I remember standing alone in my apartment, surrounded by objects chosen to project a version of myself that felt increasingly theoretical. The mirror in the hallway caught me mid-step, and for a split second I didn't recognize the person moving through my space. That disconnect wasn't fear-inducing, it was clarifying. Like realizing you've been answering to the wrong name. I didn't decide to crossdress that night in the way people imagine decisions being made. It was more like giving up resistance. I had experimented before, privately, cautiously, always followed by guilt and rationalization. This time, instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" I asked, "What happens if I stop interrogating it?" The clothes themselves were unremarkable. Soft fabrics. Neutral tones. Nothing theatrical. What surprised me wasn't how I looked, but how my posture changed. My breathing slowed. My thoughts softened around the edges. I wasn't becoming someone else, I was subtracting something. Armor, maybe. Or noise. That distinction would become important later, when people began to project stories onto me that didn't match my internal reality. Early on, I struggled with the labels available to me. Words like bimbo, when they eventually entered my orbit, felt both absurd and instructive. Absurd because they flattened something deeply personal into caricature. Instructive because they revealed how quickly society tries to make meaning of ambiguity by reaching for stereotype. I learned that feminization, in the public imagination, often comes bundled with assumptions about intelligence, agency, and worth. Those assumptions weren't abstract anymore, they were aimed at me. But in the beginning, none of that existed yet. There was only me, alone, learning how unfamiliar honesty can feel when you've lived without it. What I didn't expect was grief. Not for my old self exactly, but for the years I'd spent dismissing signals that now seemed painfully obvious. I grieved conversations I'd never allowed myself to have, relationships I'd kept shallow out of fear of being seen too clearly. With that grief came responsibility. If I was going to continue, I owed it to the people in my life, and to myself, to do this with integrity. That meant slowing down. Paying attention. Not turning my exploration into a performance, or worse, an escape from accountability. I wasn't trying to erase my past, I was trying to understand it. The first person I told wasn't who you'd expect. Not my closest friend, not a family member. It was a coworker I barely knew but trusted instinctively. We were sitting in a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, talking about nothing important, when I heard myself say, quietly, "I think I've been living out of alignment with myself." I didn't even mention gender at first. I talked about discomfort. About confusion. About the strange relief of letting myself experiment. She listened without interrupting. When I finally said, "I've started expressing myself differently," she nodded like I'd told her the weather. "That sounds like it took courage," she said. No questions. No labels. Just acknowledgement. That moment recalibrated something in me. It taught me that understanding doesn't always arrive through explanation. Sometimes it arrives through presence. As I continued, the internal changes outpaced the external ones. I became more attentive to others' vulnerabilities because I was finally tending to my own. I noticed how rigid expectations limit everyone, not just those who visibly deviate from them. I started to understand femininity not as an aesthetic, but as a relational experience, how I occupied space, how I listened, how I allowed myself to be affected. There were still days of doubt. Days when the mirror felt like an adversary again. But even then, the reflection no longer flinched away from me. We were learning each other's language. Looking back now, I see that this wasn't the beginning of becoming someone new. It was the beginning of telling the truth in smaller, braver increments. The consequences, social, emotional, ethical, were still ahead of me, waiting to test whether this honesty could survive contact with the world. At the time, all I knew was this: whatever I was stepping into, I would have to walk forward consciously, with empathy, and with the willingness to be misunderstood without becoming careless. That was the real transformation starting to take shape. The first real test wasn't public, it was relational, and it arrived quietly, the way most consequential things do. As my internal world shifted, I became acutely aware of how much of my previous life had been organized around avoidance. I had been skilled at steering conversations away from anything that required vulnerability, adept at presenting competence instead of curiosity. As I allowed myself to explore femininity, not as costume, but as orientation toward myself, I lost the ability to hide behind that old efficiency. Feelings surfaced faster. So did questions. And once they were present, I couldn't pretend they belonged to someone else. I began by telling my closest friend, the one who had known me longest and, I thought, most completely. We had shared apartments, failures, inside jokes that could derail an entire evening. If anyone could hold this truth without flinching, it would be him. I rehearsed the conversation for days, not the words themselves but the emotional posture, how steady I wanted to be, how open. When the moment came, I didn't frame it as an announcement. I framed it as a process. I told him I was learning things about myself that I had ignored for years, that I was experimenting with gender expression in ways that felt grounding rather than performative. I emphasized that I wasn't asking him to understand everything, only to listen. He did listen. He asked careful questions. But beneath his attentiveness was a subtle recalibration I couldn't miss. His eyes searched my face as if checking for signs of instability. At one point he said, "I just don't want you to do something you'll regret." It wasn't cruel. It was protective. Still, it landed heavily. That sentence followed me for weeks. Not because it was wrong, but because it revealed how often we mistake unfamiliarity for danger. I asked myself whether I was, in fact, running towards something reckless. Whether this exploration was a response to dissatisfaction rather than a movement toward authenticity. Those questions mattered. I owed it to everyone involved, including myself, to answer them honestly. So I slowed down further. I paid attention to cause and effect. When I expressed myself more openly, did I feel dissociated or more present? When I imagined retreating back into my old habits, did I feel relief or constriction? The answers were consistent, if not always comforting. Presence increased. So did responsibility. As I became more visible in small ways, softer clothing, subtle changes in how I carried myself, I encountered a new social mirror. Strangers reacted before I spoke. Some with curiosity, some with discomfort, a few with unexpected warmth. I learned how much gender expression operates as a kind of social shorthand, shaping assumptions about competence, intent, even intelligence. Comments that would never have been directed at me before suddenly appeared, often cloaked as jokes. I felt the sting of being underestimated, and with it, a deeper empathy for people who navigate that terrain daily. This was where the caricatures crept in. Words that tried to compress complexity into something digestible. I became aware of how easily feminized bodies are reduced to spectacle, how quickly depth is dismissed when presentation deviates from expectation. Rather than internalizing those projections, I studied them. What fear did they reveal? What hierarchy were they protecting? I also noticed something subtler, moments when I benefited from my own prior privilege. Situations where my voice still carried authority because of who people remembered me as. That awareness came with obligation. I couldn't claim a new identity without also acknowledging the old advantages that hadn't vanished overnight. Integrity demanded that I hold both truths at once. Family conversations were harder. Not louder, just heavier. My parents listened politely, asked practical questions, avoided emotional ones. They wanted reassurance that I was still me, as if that version were a fixed artifact rather than a living process. I learned to translate my experience into terms they could approach: alignment, mental health, honesty. Over time, resistance softened into something like cautious respect. Love didn't disappear, it recalibrated. What surprised me most during this period was how much my moral framework sharpened. I became more attentive to consent in conversation, to the impact of my choices on others' sense of safety. Feminization, for me, wasn't about becoming less serious, it was about becoming more accountable. I felt a responsibility to represent this exploration not as escapism, but as an ethical commitment to truth. There were still moments of doubt sharp enough to stop me mid-step. Bathrooms. Forms. Old acquaintances. Each carried the risk of confrontation or erasure. But each also offered a chance to practice self-respect without defensiveness. I learned that confidence doesn't always look like certainty. Sometimes it looks like patience. By the end of that first year, I no longer thought of myself as transitioning towards something. I was inhabiting something. A way of being that allowed for nuance, contradiction, growth. I hadn't solved myself. I had, however, stopped treating my inner life as a problem to be managed. That shift changed how I loved, how I listened, how I occupied silence. It also set the stage for conflicts I couldn't yet see, moments when empathy would be tested, when the world would demand explanations I wasn't obligated to provide. But those challenges were coming. And I was no longer interested in hiding from them. The period that followed was the most psychologically demanding stretch of my life, not because anything catastrophic happened, but because nothing did. There was no singular crisis to justify the intensity of what I was feeling. Instead, there was accumulation, small moments stacking into permanent change, each one asking whether I was paying attention. Once my presentation shifted beyond what could be politely ignored, the world began responding to me differently in ways that were both obvious and strangely hard to articulate. It wasn't just how people looked at me, it was when they looked away. Conversations shortened. Instructions became more detailed, as if my competence required extra scaffolding. Compliments appeared that had nothing to do with my work or ideas and everything to do with how I appeared to be inhabiting my body. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was imagining patterns because I was hyper-aware. But repetition has a way of eroding denial. Eventually, I had to confront the uncomfortable truth. I was being read through a narrower lens, and that lens came preloaded with assumptions I had never had to manage before. What made this difficult wasn't resentment, it was recognition. I saw, with startling clarity, behaviors I had once participated in unconsciously. Interruptions framed as enthusiasm. Doubt disguised as concern. Praise that subtly redirected attention away from substance. Realizing this didn't inspire self-loathing, but it did demand accountability. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. This was also the phase where solitude became essential. Not withdrawal, but intentional quiet. I needed space away from interpretation to hear my own internal signals clearly. During long walks, I paid attention to how my thoughts moved when no one was watching. I noticed that my internal dialogue had softened. I was less punitive toward myself, more curious. When mistakes happened, I corrected them without the old internal shaming rituals. That shift alone felt transformative. But solitude has a way of amplifying unresolved questions. I began asking myself harder things. Was I conflating femininity with permission to be gentler? Had I been denying myself emotional range because I thought it conflicted with masculinity? And if so, what responsibility did I have to untangle those ideas publicly rather than quietly benefiting from my own growth? These questions mattered because people were watching, not in the sensational way stories often imply, but in the ordinary way communities observe change. Coworkers noticed my increased patience. Friends commented on how present I seemed. A few asked if I was happier. That question unsettled me, because happiness felt too small a word for what I was experiencing. This wasn't joy replacing sadness. It was congruence replacing fragmentation. Still, not all reactions were benign. There were moments of overt dismissal, jokes that framed my exploration as indulgent or unserious. Once, during a group discussion, someone suggested I was leaning into an image, as if this were branding rather than self-examination. I felt the old instinct rise, to over-explain, to justify. Instead, I paused. Then I said, calmly, I'm not performing anything. I'm paying attention. The conversation moved on, but something shifted. I had named my stance without defensiveness. That moment marked a turning point in how I understood power. Not as dominance or persuasion, but as steadiness. The ability to remain intact without demanding agreement. Feminization, for me, became inseparable from that lesson. It wasn't about being perceived a certain way, it was about choosing how I responded when perception diverged from reality. Family dynamics continued evolving in parallel. My parents began asking more reflective questions, not about outcomes but about experience. One evening, my mother said, "You seem more deliberate." It wasn't praise exactly, but it was observation without fear. I realized then how much my earlier secrecy had been protective not just of myself, but of others' comfort. Letting that go was an act of trust. There were setbacks. Days when exhaustion made me question whether the constant translation of self to world was sustainable. Days when I missed the invisibility I once took for granted. But even then, retreat felt less appealing than rest. I wasn't trying to disappear anymore, I was learning how to remain. Educational moments emerged unexpectedly. People asked questions, not the invasive kind, but genuine ones. How did I know this wasn't a phase? What did femininity mean to me? I answered honestly, emphasizing uncertainty rather than certainty, process rather than destination. I found that framing my experience as ongoing invited understanding more effectively than presenting it as resolved. What I learned during this period was that identity isn't clarified through declaration, it's clarified through behavior over time. Through consistency. Through the willingness to be corrected. Through choosing empathy even when it's inconvenient. By the end of this stretch, I had stopped measuring progress by external validation. I measured it by internal coherence. Did my actions align with my values? Was I kinder without becoming passive? Was I honest without becoming brittle? Those questions replaced the old anxieties about passing or perception. I hadn't become simpler. I had become integrated. And integration, I discovered, is quiet work. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in how you listen, how you apologize, how you stay present when misunderstanding would make retreat easier. That quiet work was far from finished. In fact, it was about to be tested in ways I couldn't yet anticipate, ways that would force me to confront not just how I saw myself, but how much responsibility I was willing to carry for the space I occupied. The next stretch unfolded less like a revelation and more like an audit of habits, instincts, and the quiet assumptions I carried without realizing how tightly they shaped my behavior. If earlier phases had been about permission, this one was about responsibility. Not the heavy, punitive kind, but the kind that asks you to live up to what you now understand. By this point, people no longer treated my changes as temporary. That shift brought a different kind of attention. The questions stopped being curious and started being evaluative. Not hostile, just weighing. As if my consistency were under review. I felt that pressure acutely, and for a while I resented it. Then I realized something uncomfortable. This is what credibility feels like when you're no longer protected by default assumptions. I became more careful with my words, not because I felt fragile, but because I recognized how easily language can reinforce hierarchies. I noticed how often women and gender nonconforming people are expected to soften disagreement, to be palatable even when asserting truth. I caught myself doing it too, adding qualifiers, smiling through tension, minimizing my certainty to keep others comfortable. Seeing that pattern didn't immediately dissolve it, but it gave me choice. And choice changed everything. At work, expectations subtly shifted. I was interrupted more. Decisions I made confidently before were now revisited, sometimes redundantly. Early on, I tried compensating by being impeccable, over-prepared, endlessly agreeable. It took time to understand that excellence doesn't cancel bias, it just reveals it more clearly. The lesson wasn't to work harder. It was to take up space deliberately. One afternoon, during a meeting that had gone in circles, I stated my position plainly and didn't cushion it. The room went quiet, not offended, just surprised. Then the discussion moved forward. No drama. No backlash. That moment taught me something vital. Asserting myself didn't betray my femininity, it grounded it. Gentleness and firmness were not opposites. They were collaborators. Outside of structured spaces, the emotional terrain was more complex. Strangers felt freer to comment, sometimes kindly, sometimes carelessly. Compliments landed differently now, often detached from context, occasionally condescending. I learned how visibility invites entitlement. Not always malicious, but often unexamined. Navigating that required boundaries I had never needed before. Saying no without explanation became a skill, one that felt radical in its simplicity. This was also when I began reckoning more fully with the word bimbo and why it unsettled me so deeply. Not because of offense, but because of what it erased. The assumption that femininity, especially when visibly embraced, must correlate with diminished seriousness. That intellectual depth and self-awareness somehow evaporate when presentation shifts. I refused that trade. Not performatively, quietly, persistently. By continuing to show up as thoughtful, accountable, and engaged, I let contradiction do its work. Internally, I was changing too. I noticed that my emotional responses were more nuanced. I could hold conflicting feelings without rushing to resolve them. Discomfort no longer felt like failure, it felt like information. When relationships strained, I didn't default to self-blame or defensiveness. I asked better questions. I listened longer. That shift altered my friendships in unexpected ways. Some deepened. A few faded. None ended explosively. They simply revealed their limits. One relationship, in particular, forced me to confront my own blind spots. A friend accused me, gently, of speaking about femininity rather than from within it. At first, I bristled. Then I sat with it. I realized she wasn't questioning my identity, she was questioning my awareness of how much I still occupied interpretive authority. I had the language, the platform, the patience of being listened to. Others didn't. Acknowledging that didn't diminish my experience, it contextualized it. That conversation marked a turning point. I stopped positioning myself as an example and started positioning myself as a participant. Less explaining. More listening. Less framing my journey as insight. More allowing it to be one thread among many. Family dynamics matured in parallel. My parents no longer asked for reassurance. They asked for stories. Not explanations, stories. What surprised me was how that shifted our relationship. They weren't trying to understand gender, they were trying to understand me. And for the first time, I wasn't filtering myself for their comfort. I trusted them with ambiguity. That trust was returned slowly, imperfectly, but sincerely. There were moments of exhaustion so deep I questioned whether all this attentiveness was sustainable. But each time I imagined returning to who I had been, the thought felt distant, almost fictional. I wasn't rejecting that version of myself, I was honoring it by not forcing it to continue performing a role it had outgrown. What I learned during this phase was that authenticity isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It asks for consistency. For the courage to be misunderstood without becoming rigid. For the humility to be corrected without retreating into shame. By the end of this stretch, I no longer thought of my transformation as something happening to me. It was something I was actively stewarding. With care. With restraint. With an increasing awareness that how I lived this truth mattered as much as the truth itself. And just when I thought I had found equilibrium, life introduced a new variable, one that would test not just my self-understanding, but my capacity for empathy when it mattered most. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly equilibrium invites disruption, not as punishment, but as examination. Once I had learned how to stand comfortably within myself, life shifted the focus outward and asked a harder question: what do you do with this understanding when it intersects with other people's pain? The catalyst wasn't dramatic. It was a misunderstanding that should have been minor and became significant only because of timing. A colleague knew, observant, still feeling out the terrain, misread something I said as condescension. She didn't confront me directly. Instead, the distance arrived first, shorter replies, guarded politeness, a subtle tightening of the room when we shared space. Months earlier, I might have ignored it or assumed it would resolve itself. This time, it unsettled me. I recognized that look. I had seen it directed at me before, someone bracing, unsure whether they were being taken seriously. The realization landed with weight. I had caused, unintentionally, the very discomfort I'd spent years learning to name. I asked to talk. Not defensively, not urgently, just directly. I told her I sensed tension and wanted to understand it. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. She said she sometimes felt I spoke for people rather than with them. That my confidence, while calm, sometimes felt final. Like there wasn't room to enter the conversation without pushing. Her words stayed with me long after we parted. Not because they were harsh, but because they were precise. I replayed moments I had considered neutral and saw how they might have felt otherwise from a different position. This wasn't about gender expression or presentation, it was about power. About how easily certainty can crowd out collaboration when it's not tempered with invitation. I apologized. Not the rehearsed kind, but the kind that acknowledges impact without explanation. Then I changed my behavior. I asked more questions. I paused longer. I let silence do some of the work I used to fill reflexively. Over time, the tension eased, not because I was forgiven, but because trust was rebuilt through consistency. That experience recalibrated my understanding of empathy. I had thought of it primarily as sensitivity, being aware of others' feelings, adjusting my tone. What I learned instead was that empathy is structural. It requires examining how your position, history, and perceived authority shape interactions even when your intent is benign. This lesson extended beyond work. I noticed it in friendships, especially with women who had long navigated spaces where being heard was conditional. I realized how tempting it is, when newly aware, to overcorrect, to narrate your growth as proof of understanding. But understanding isn't self-certified. It's relational. It's granted slowly, if at all, and only through demonstrated care. There was grief in this realization. A quiet kind. I mourned the fantasy that personal transformation automatically translated into moral clarity. It doesn't. It sharpens perception, yes, but it also exposes how much remains unlearned. That humility became grounding rather than discouraging. I no longer needed to be right, I needed to be receptive. Public perception continued to fluctuate. Some people praised my bravery in ways that felt disproportionate. Others dismissed my journey as indulgent. Both reactions felt incomplete. Courage, I learned, isn't defined by visibility. It's defined by follow-through, by how you behave when no one is watching, when praise and critique have equal volume. During this time, I became more intentional about mentorship, not as an authority, but as a companion. When younger colleagues or acquaintances confided confusion about identity or belonging, I resisted the urge to offer answers. Instead, I shared uncertainty. I talked about patience. About the difference between exploration and performance. About the importance of not rushing toward a label just to quiet discomfort. Those conversations felt truer than any declaration I could make about myself. Family life settled into something resembling normalcy. Not resolution, but rhythm. My parents no longer introduced my changes as news. They simply introduced me. Occasionally, a question surfaced, tentative, earnest. I answered when I could, admitted when I couldn't. That honesty, I think, mattered more than reassurance ever could. Internally, something else shifted. The urgency that once accompanied my exploration softened into stewardship. I wasn't chasing alignment anymore, I was maintaining it. That meant rest. It meant boundaries. It meant allowing myself to be ordinary. Feminization, for me, stopped being an event and became a context, one lens among many through which I understood myself. The irony was that as this aspect of my identity integrated more fully, it occupied less mental space. I thought about ethics more than expression. About how to show up consistently. About how to repair harm when it happened. About how to remain open without becoming porous. I understood then that transformation stories often end too early. They stop at self-recognition or public acknowledgement, as if those moments are conclusions. They're not. They're thresholds. What follows is quieter and harder to dramatize: maintenance, accountability, and the ongoing work of living in relationship with others. By the end of this phase, I no longer felt like I was proving anything, to myself or anyone else. I felt anchored. Not finished, but oriented. And that orientation prepared me for the final reckoning I hadn't yet named, the realization that identity, fully inhabited, carries obligation, not to represent, but to respond. That realization would shape how I understood my past, and more importantly, how I chose to move forward. It took me a long time to recognize that what I was moving toward wasn't resolution, but responsibility. Not the kind that arrives with a title or a declaration, but the quieter kind that settles in once you stop narrating yourself and start living with consequence. By then, the urgency that had once driven me had softened into something steadier. I wasn't waking up each day asking who I was becoming. I was waking up asking how I was behaving. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Identity, once it stops being a question mark, becomes a lens. It shapes what you notice, what you tolerate, what you interrupt. It asks you to live up to it without applause. I began to see how often people around me were carrying their own unnamed tensions. Coworkers who spoke confidently in private and cautiously in meetings. Friends who joked about dissatisfaction because seriousness felt risky. Family members who clung to familiar roles long after those roles stopped fitting. Before, I might have tried to fix things or offer reassurance. Now, I recognized something else was needed first: space. Permission without pressure. What my own journey had taught me, slowly, sometimes painfully, was that change rarely announces itself cleanly. It arrives in fragments. In second thoughts. In moments when the old reflex no longer works and you're forced to pause. I became protective of those pauses, both in myself and in others. I stopped mistaking hesitation for weakness. Often, it was discernment in progress. There were times people asked me to explain myself, not out of hostility but out of confusion. I learned to resist the urge to compress years of internal work into something easily digestible. Simplification can be a kindness, but it can also be a lie. Instead, I spoke about process. About paying attention. About how alignment feels less like excitement and more like reduced friction. That answer disappointed some people. It reassured others. I learned to let both reactions exist without trying to manage them. I also revisited my past with more generosity than I thought possible. I saw how carefully I had constructed safety, even when it looked like avoidance. How masculinity had once given me structure when I didn't yet trust myself with ambiguity. How my earlier resistance to femininity wasn't hatred or shame, but fear of exposure, of being seen as unfinished. Understanding that didn't excuse everything, but it softened the judgment. Growth, I realized, is easier to sustain when it's not fueled by self-contempt. The caricatures that once bothered me lost much of their power. Not because they disappeared, but because I stopped organizing myself in response to them. Labels that flattened complexity only worked if I accepted their premise. I didn't need to reclaim or refute them publicly. I could simply live in ways that made them irrelevant. Depth doesn't need defense, it reveals itself over time. What surprised me most was how ordinary life became again. Not numb, just stable. I cooked meals without thinking about symbolism. I chose clothes without rehearsing reactions. I moved through public spaces without scanning for threat or validation. The mirror became unremarkable. That, more than anything, told me the transformation had integrated. When something stops demanding attention, it has usually found its place. That ordinariness made room for something else: ethics. With fewer internal resources spent on self-surveillance, I became more attentive to impact. I noticed when I spoke too quickly, when certainty crowded out collaboration, when my comfort depended on someone else shrinking. I didn't always catch these moments in time. When I missed them, I learned to repair without dramatizing the mistake or centering my guilt. Accountability, I discovered, is most meaningful when it's proportionate. Empathy changed shape for me during this phase. It stopped being primarily emotional resonance and became more behavioral. Less, I understand how you feel, and more, I will adjust how I act. That shift felt truer. Feelings fluctuate. Practices endure. Feminization, for me, ultimately wasn't about softness, it was about responsiveness. The willingness to be changed by what you learn without needing that change to be visible or affirmed. I also learned that not every misunderstanding needs resolution. Some simply need endurance. Being misread no longer sent me into spirals of explanation. I evaluated whether clarity would help or whether silence was the more respectful option. Discernment replaced defensiveness. That alone felt like a form of maturity I hadn't known before. Near what might be called the end of this arc, though nothing truly ends, I realized I had stopped thinking of my journey as exceptional. It wasn't a story I needed to tell constantly. It was a context I lived within. That shift felt important. When identity becomes background rather than headline, it frees you to engage with the world more fully. If there is something I hope lingers for anyone encountering this story, it isn't instruction or inspiration. It's permission to move slowly. To resist caricature, both imposed and self-generated. To understand that self-acceptance is not indulgence, but groundwork. And that integrity is not a trait you achieve once, but a practice you return to daily, often quietly, often imperfectly. The transformation that began years earlier with a moment of flinching didn't conclude with certainty or arrival. It concluded with steadiness. With the ability to remain present through ambiguity without abandoning myself or others. With a deeper respect for how much courage it takes, not to become someone new, but to stop pretending you already are. I don't think about beginnings anymore. What stays with me now is continuity. There are mornings when I wake and nothing about my life feels symbolic. The light comes in at the wrong angle. The coffee tastes slightly off. My body feels like a body, either problem nor project. Those mornings tell me more about where I've landed than any mirror ever did. They tell me I'm living, not auditioning. The questions people used to ask, what are you now, where does this end, what does it mean, have lost their urgency. Not because they were answered definitively, but because I learned which questions deserved my attention. The important ones turned out to be practical. Am I honest today? Am I paying attention? Am I willing to repair what I damage, even unintentionally? Sometimes I catch glimpses of who I might have been if I'd never allowed myself to change. That version of me isn't tragic. Just narrower. I feel tenderness toward him now. He carried what he could with the tools he had. Letting him rest was not a betrayal, it was an act of care. What I know, finally, is this: identity isn't something you claim once and defend forever. It's something you tend. It grows when you listen, when you slow down, when you let yourself be corrected without collapsing. It withers when you harden it into performance or proof. I don't need the world to agree with me. I need to remain reachable, to myself and to others. That is the standard I measure my days by now. If there is any quiet wisdom earned here, it's that becoming whole rarely looks like triumph. It looks like steadiness. Like choosing not to disappear when things get uncomfortable. Like learning how to stay. And that, in the end, has been enough.